Good Friday morning, Backyard Naturalist friends, and welcome to a bonus episode of the show. My name is Tim, and I will be your host today. And today we are looking at things that float, and not like in a David Letterman, will it float or will it sink? Um, Here in Wisconsin, you may choose to enjoy swimming in our thousands of lakes or rivers or ponds, or you just may choose to look out over those thousands and thousands of lakes and ponds and water features. And when you do, you might find some things that are floating on the surface, and you may ask yourself, I wonder what that is. I've done that quite a few times. So today we're going to look at a few of the common things or common reasons you may find things floating on the surfaces of these waters. So sit back and relax if you can in front of the warm glow of your device. Maybe grab a nice warm beverage on my behalf on this fall day, but feels like summer still. And as we bring you this bonus episode of the Backyard Naturalist, Float On. And the inspiration for this episode came from our very own Maggie Steinhauer when she texted Amanda and I this photo. It was actually a video, but this is a screenshot of what she found floating in a lake and thought, what is this? And I thought, oh, it could be a couple of things. And then I thought, ooh, this could be a backyard naturalist topic. So it is, and here we are. So thank you, Maggie. Um, and when I think of things that I see floating in lakes, I have a particular lake in mind, and that is Plum Lake up in Sainer, Wisconsin, where every night looks like this. This is actually there's an astronomy club that took a really nice photo of Plum Lake. Um, but so this is up in Sainer near Minocqua, where we've camped since childhood, and now where we go with our kids to camp. Um, and I have spent many, 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 many hours playing in and thinking about and wondering about the wildlife that I see, and sometimes more the wildlife that I don't see. Um, so I've definitely stared at the surface of this lake many, many times, especially at night, thinking, what is going on below the surface? And those are some of my absolute favorite memories. It's just the things that I imagine are there, um, just you know, either staring back at me or just doing whatever they need to do. And then as I got older, it wasn't just staring at it, it was swimming in the lake at night. Getting over my fears of being in the water at night and embracing the wonder of being in the water at night, with or without a swimsuit. But also just imagining what was underneath my feet. And there's still that like little primal fear of what might be there, but there's also a wonder. And I knew there were big fish. And, these are the same fish that I knew I would catch one day, with my little bobber and worm. And I certainly have dreamt that I've caught these huge fish. Um, but yeah, again, at night it's like a little more scared because that's probably when the muskie are coming out. And as I got older, I started to convince myself that I this probably wasn't a threat to me. Although my kids aren't so sure now. When we return there, there's always that musky danger lurking underneath the ground. We knew there were leeches. We've seen them swimming day and night, and we've removed them from many an ankle and toe of family members. That's always fun to think about. And then I also just love bringing a flashlight to the water's edge at night. I still do that with the kids, where you just kind of want to see what's coming out. And usually the fun things to find are the menacing claws of the crayfish, which also deserve a backyard naturalist episode of their own. Um, but these were, the unseen things that sometimes you would see with the help of a flashlight, but then sometimes you wouldn't, and you just had to keep them in your imagination. But these weren't the floaters like the little blob that Maggie found. And then, of course, in my 8-year-old brain in particular, there were the things that I was most concerned about. This individual in particular, one of the first scary movies that I've ever seen that haunted my dreams along with Godzilla. And I don't know if you all remember when the local TV stations would play this movie in 3D, The Creature from the Black Lagoon, and you had to go to a store to get the goggles or the glasses. And then you still had to go and adjust some things on your TV set. So if you took the glasses off, it kind of looked like this, the old 3D trick. But I do remember the first time seeing that in 3D and that monster coming out at me. Um, I've watched it again. It doesn't travel super well, but certainly as a kid, this was things that I was thinking about when I thought of Plum Lake. Um, and then there's the things that aren't necessarily floating, but they're on the surface of the water. They're maybe a little less scary because you see them in the daylight. So there's, a decent population of water snakes, and as a naturalist, I just have this strong urge to catch things and grab them, and I figured out a way to start to catch these water snakes without being bit, but they are. I don't know if ornery is a ecological term, but these are some of the most ornery snakes out there, and it's not like picking up a garter snake, and you usually catching them results in some nice bites. Um, so not floaters, but they're swimmers. And then there's other floaters that also swim, um, like this one that, again, one of my favorite reasons to go up north, producing the most haunting and iconic sound of the North Woods. But we're going to look at a slightly different categories of things on the surface. So these are the true floaters, not the swimmers. And we're not going to do all the floaters, but I found three in particular that I've questioned, including Maggie's little blob. So these are the things that my memory invokes of finding, of wondering, and we'll start with the things that aren't what Maggie found. Um, and I've seen this category of floaters throughout the world, not just on the lakes of the Northwoods, the rivers, the oceans. At first glance, you think pollution. I mean, what is this crap that's on the surface of the water? Um, it looks unnatural, it looks dangerous. Um, and eventually, I found out what this was. And it turns out that this is very common, natural, and um, not harmful. And this is pollen, natural and wholesome. And if you see this much pollen on the surface of a body of water, you can pretty much be assured that there's wind pollinated plants nearby. So, the conifers for sure, like pines. Sometimes you get poplars like cottonwood trees. Anything that's wind pollinated, uh, a lot of times you'll find this coating on the surface. And sometimes it just looks nasty and it makes the water look completely uninviting. This is Devil's Lake in Wisconsin. We were talking about this earlier. But if you were to swim in it, it's completely harmless. It's not going to hurt you, just maybe not so inviting, maybe not so much, like something you'd really want to swim in. This is eucalyptus pollen on the Mediterranean Sea. They're usually a yellowish, uh, but they can be a little bit greenish, a little bit tanner, a little orangey shades of pollen. And I remember talking to my kids about this when we saw it on the Flambeau turtle flowage up north, and we were fishing, of course. And my son's fishing line got tangled up in some pine branches, and then when he pulled the line to get the line out of the tree, the tree branch shook, and we just saw this massive plume of pollen bursting into the air. It was very cool. It was a cool visual because we had just talked about all the pollen on the lake, and this was a great visual confirmation that what we saw in the water was pollen from all the surrounding trees. Um, and sometimes rain or a windstorm, if you've ever been camping in the spring, can bring pollen onto just kind of coating the ground, not just the water. So you might find, just yellowish film on everything, on your camping equipment, on your vehicles, your tent. It's just you're there at the right time, and the pollen is spreading. And so biologically, what's going on, all of these pollen grains you're seeing are kind of wasted. They're not, um, they are not, they did not do their intended purpose as pollen grains. And so, what is uh, their intended purpose? I think we all know this. I'm just going to take a brief second here to, um, I apologize for this. Okay. Um, okay, there we go. So back to sharing my screen. Oh, it wouldn't be a backyard naturalist if I didn't have something going on here. Okay, here we go. I'm sharing back to where we were. Why is this not working? Amanda, what did I do? I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to share again. There we go. Okay. So we see this pollen everywhere. And again, it's usually in spring. And so what the purpose of this pollen is obviously reproduction. And under a high power microscope, this is really cool. The pollen grains themselves look like they have little Mickey Mouse ears. You can see this, and those the ones that you can see with the two little bumps, those are actually air sacs. And the goal of those air sacs is that if this is a wind pollinated plant, um, this is this is their way of staying aloft longer. It's just a little bit longer. The more they're in the air, the better chance they have of reaching their intended target. Because you're basically just, okay, wind, take all my little pollen grains and try to find where it's supposed to go. Um, and where and these come from the male pine cones. So they're smaller and shorter lived, and so you'll see them on the pine trees in spring. And if you give it a good shake, don't do this if you have allergies, then you'll see that plume of airborne pollen. So the hope of those grains is that the air currents will take them to a receptive female pine cone like this one. Doesn't look like the pine cone we're used to yet. This is because it's all closed up and kind of has that lighter colored. This is a receptive female pine cone. And when this plume of pollen surrounds the cone, enough of those tiny grains make their way into the tiny openings that you can't really see here, um, similar to probably like a sperm fertilizing an egg. And you just need, a one in the hole, and then the fertilization will take place underneath these kind of protected scales. And the scales remain closed while the young seeds develop inside. And then when the seeds are ready, the pine cone opens up and then releases the mature seeds, and they just kind of fall out. And they're also wind dispersed. So the pine cone, there is control over when they're open and closed. They will open during conditions that are conducive to dispersal of the seeds, which would be dry for sure and windy days. Um, if it rains, which it would not be conducive to these seeds dispersing in the wind, you will see the pine cones temporarily close again because they don't want to release their seeds during rainy weather. And then it becomes dry again, they'll open up. And you can experiment with this at home. If you take a pine cone that is open and submerge it in water, it's just the physics that you can get that pine cone to close up again. And even if it doesn't have the seeds, it's still the turgor pressure and everything, it's still going to do this. So that's a good example of um, how the pine cones work. So that's the first category of things floating in our lakes, these pollen booms of the spent pollen that didn't make it where it's supposed to, but completely harmless. It is important to notice that you can confuse pollen with algae. blooms. And algae blooms are a slightly different color. They're usually bright green. Algae blooms are an entirely different beast. And even though they're natural, and we've talked about them in past episodes, they can be harmful to humans and other wildlife. So if it's a bright green, that's something you're best to avoid. So the next category is this. So this is something I've seen quite frequently. I've wondered, I've had folks tell me what it is. People have told me that it's soap for people washing their hair in the lakes. Uh, Again, when you look at it, you think pollution, uninviting, don't go there. But actually, most of the time, what you see is a naturally occurring phenomenon. It is usually harmless. It looks like foam because it is foam. And you'll often see this in high energy environments. So that could either be like streams with rapids or drops or waves that will whip up the water. And it's 9 times out of 10, this foam is just whatever the organic content of the water gets whipped up. And it's similar to the mechanical motion of when you put egg whites in a blender, the high energy of the blades turn the egg whites into that delicious meringue. But in this case, instead of egg whites, it's a similar physical process. It's just that the fast-moving water then whips up the organic materials into this foam. So you often see, again, if there's high energy environments, that's when you see this foam. Um, and Oftentimes it will take a brownish reddish color, and that's perfectly natural. It looks dirty, it looks polluted, but if you think about it, that is just when you take organic content and you whip it up, it's going to have a color. If you think of tannins from oak leaves, that will also color the water a kind of a rusty red. It looks dirty, but really that's just the natural tannins or the minerals or whatever kind of is in the water, whatever the organic content. So again, usually when you see this, it's fine. The problem is sometimes it's not. And if you see a very bright white um, like this, and it just looks unnatural, then it probably isn't natural. It probably is pollution. So this could be PFAS from the fire suppressing materials they use. Oftentimes in airports, you'll see this running into waterways. They get into the water. They're whipped up just like everything else, but they're whipped up into maybe a less natural looking foam. So if it has a smell that is earthy or fishy, it's probably the natural stuff. If it has a smell that's like a perfume or just something that is less natural, then it probably is the pollution. Um, so like it could be, a soap, or it could be agricultural runoff. It could be quite a few different chemicals that get whipped up and find this. So uh, you would want to avoid it if it were the second category because you don't know what kind of chemicals are in it, and that's bad. So again, 9 times out of 10, this foam you see is fine, perfectly natural, normal. Um, but in occasions it's not. And when you do see this type of thing, or if you suspect it, it is worth calling, either your local agency, government agency, or there's some nonprofits that you can have kind of hotlines to call, and then they can kind of figure out what's going on, what the source of the pollution is. So back to Maggie's question. Um, I had a couple thoughts with this might be. My first thought was that it was a bryozoan. Um, and if we had another season of Backyard Naturalists, I certainly would do an episode on bryozoans. They're just so cool. And I probably would have done a bunch of episodes on like the really ancient forms of life that are still with us, like the cypresses and ginkgos and stromatolites and lycopods in particular. But bryozoa is a colony of animals, ancient animals, that we get in the lakes in Wisconsin that have fossil records going back like 500 million years. Technically, they're not floating. They're they can look like they're floating, but they're usually anchored to aquatic plants, or if they get jostled, they could float. But they do want to attach themselves to things like plants or docks. They're filter feeders, and when you see them, it can be an indication that the water quality is good, because they're filtering the water. And then if you get bad stuff in the water, then they get into the bryozoa, and then the bryozoa will disappear if you get too polluted. There's over 5,000 species. They take many, many, many different forms. Sometimes they're called moss animals. Um, they are indeed animals, and they're often confused for like egg masses, like frogs. They're confused for algae clumps, depending on how you see it. Um, but to me, it's really cool that we have this animal here in Wisconsin. You usually think of these like ancient animals being in the oceans or faraway places, um, but uh, this is a pretty cool colony of ancient animals that we can find in our lakes. But when, this was my initial thought to Maggie, was that you probably have a bryozoan, but then when I kind of looked into it, I was like, no, it's probably not. It didn't look like it. So I'm 95% sure that what Maggie found it's called nostoc, also known as witch's jelly or star jelly. It has cool names like troll's butter, spit of moon, fallen star, um, and witch's butter or witch's jelly. There is a fungus, also known as witch's butter, entirely different. Um, but nostoc is the most common genus of cyanobacteria, which you might know of as blue-green algae. Um, and uh, we have covered a little bit of the algae on this program, but the cyanobacteria, at the end of the day, if there's anything you bring home, this might be the group of organisms that has been most important to the history of life on Earth, and that's not an exaggeration. Um, it it was the first group of organisms that turned sunlight into oxygen. So this is the group responsible for essentially oxygenating the Earth's atmosphere and paving the way for life to crawl out of the ocean. That's a big deal. Uh, they it's interesting that because they were the first to do these things, they kind of paved the way for everything to follow. And so they started to photosynthesis, and they photosynthesized the blue and red spectrum, which is why they're green. And because they reflect the green, they absorb the blue and red. Because of the particular frequencies of life, that's why today forests are green. This is because what they decided, or what they evolved to use. It's why we have greenery. It's why we have green spaces. It's why we have trees of green, because that was the initial plant to do this, and all of the following life continue. Not all of it. I mean, there are some things that do photosynthesize the green wavelength, but the majority of photosynthesizers use blue and red, which is why most plants are green. They also, we can thank them for the process of carbon fixation. So as they were producing oxygen, they were turning carbon dioxide into sugars, um, which is also very important for feeding the world. So you have oxygen production, carbon fixation, sugar production, all from this one group of plants that were the first colonizers. Um, so thank you to the cyanobacteria, and you've done a great job of allowing for the evolution of terrestrial life, including us. And if that's not impressive enough, they cyanobacteria, it's a colony of single-celled organisms. So the bryozoa are a colony of animals, multicellular animals. The cyanobacteria are a colony of single-celled organisms that are mingled together with plant matter. But they were the first single-celled organisms to specialize, and they were the ones that paved the way for the eukaryotic cell, which is the basis of most advanced life. And that's what allowed multicellular life to form. So the fact that there are multicellular organisms came from this group. So again, the ancestors of pretty much everything alive today, all of our relatives. Um, and it's both aquatic and terrestrial. This is the terrestrial form. That if you look at what Maggie picked up, it's kind of in this gelatinous sheath. because it's not just the algae; it's mixing together with other plant matter, and it also is surrounded with a kind of a mucousy film around it. It's what gives it the slime, and it's what the name Nostoc, Nostoc, comes from German for nostril, because of the mucousy film that we know of as snot. So um, it's named for snot. Um, it becomes more visible to humans when it gets wet. So when it's in the water, like how Maggie found it, it's this kind of plump, slimy mass. Or you'll usually find them in wet areas, like here near mosses. But there's so many different species of cyanobacteria. There's some that can survive in the desert for years without water, but then when that rain finally comes, the little blue-green algae community just, you know, swells up into this jelly-like masses. And so to early humans, you'd see a dry desert, it rains, all of a sudden you see these masses uh, apparently appearing out of nowhere. And so you think, oh, this came from the sky. And that's why a lot of their common names are like star jelly, and some of the other things. So they kind of thought it came with the rain. It just kind of fell from the sky. But actually, they were just sitting dormant and waiting for that rain to come. Um, there were a few other candidates today, and to include in the floaties, and one of them is one of my favorites. We saw this recently when we were up at Paradise Springs. The duckweed floating in a pond. They look like tiny floating leaves, but actually they technically don't have leaves or stems. It's just like a floating plant. It's like the body of the plant is floating, and so you find these everywhere. They are often used, if you ever take biology, to demonstrate in biology labs the exponential potential growth. So if you're looking at populations over time, because it buds, in addition to having sexual reproduction, it will bud. So you have one becoming two, becoming four, becoming eight, and so on, until your petri dish is filled or a pond is filled. So they're uh, fast reproducers, um, and they can fill up an area very quickly, particularly if there's a lot of nutrients. There is a rare circumstance where you find a metallic, coppery, or oily sheen in lakes. And this is a kind of a specialized case, and it usually happens when there's minerals in the water naturally, depending on the bedrock, like iron or copper or sulfur. And you don't see this very often, but what this is bacteria that take up those minerals and are kind of floating on the surface. So it can be an indication of pollution, but usually, again, this is just a completely natural thing. So when we think about Maggie's blob, um, you know, it's just really cool because it's a curiosity in understanding the world. Um, and it just amazes me that you can find this ancient and extremely important life form everywhere. And it's just a good lesson. And what you see is just really common slimy blob. Like when you think about it, like that is again maybe the most important step in the formation of life in our planet. And so, when you see it next time, you can thank it for the processes that it's provided for us. It's got a pretty decent resume, and you can, just appreciate the fact that it's still here and still doing what it was doing millions of years ago. So, take a moment to wonder about how singularly important and unique this group of plants is. So that is the end of this bonus episode, and I will stop sharing my screen.